That can prove very dangerous because some years ago, on the way back from Europe, a steward came out on the deck of the ship one night and he said, "Are you the one who preached sermon at St. Patrick's Cathedral such and such a time?" "Yes." He said, "My, that was a wonderful sermon. Wonderful. I enjoyed every minute of that hour and a half." I said, "My good man, I never talked an hour and a half in my life." Well, he said, "It seemed that long to me." Well, tonight we're going to discuss a very remarkable man of literature. The man who forestalled communism and who understood it better than many who have lived through it. And his name, it has, we should mention, some alternate spellings. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Born in 1821 in Moscow. His father was a doctor in one of the poor hospitals of Moscow. His father was not very kind to the family, nor to the peasants when he bought a farm. The peasants later on killed him. But the son lived from 1821 to 1881. And in that relatively short span of life had three great creative moments. The first creative moment of Fyodor Dostoevsky was when he learned the meaning of freedom. Those were days when students were rather radical, and young Dostoevsky belonged to a radical group as he was studying engineering, though he always loved literature. And he was interested not in the German philosophers, as many were at the time, but in Rousseau, Saint-Simon, Fourier, and others. He wanted to establish some kind of a system where there would be no marriage, no private property, but some weird kinds of socialism. And kings and czars were jittery in those days. In the year 1848, Louis Philippe was the last king of France. He lost his throne. Nicholas I was afraid of losing his. So when he heard of this young group of revolutionists in St. Petersburg, he arrested them. 20 of them were thrown into the prison of Peter and Paul. Queer name for a prison. So it was. And then after several months in jail, on the 22nd day of December, 1849, 20 youths were led up on a platform in Skomorsky Square of St. Petersburg. There were lines of 10. Dostoevsky was sixth in the second line. The sheriff mounted the platform. He walked to each of them. He gave the sentence of the court. Condemned to death. Condemned to death. Condemned to death. 20 men, 20 minutes to wait for death. Dostoevsky nudged someone alongside of him. There was a cart down below. 20 coffins in it, black cloth over the coffins. The temperature, 20 degrees below zero. They were stripped of all their clothing except a shirt. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. Dostoevsky looked up and the sun was just coming through the clouds. It began reflecting itself against the dome of a church. And he said, in 5 minutes, I will be where the source of all that light is. And then 1 minute more, and he said, oh, if I could only live. What an eternity of days would be mine, and how I would treasure each moment. And at that moment, a soldier came across the yard waving a white flag and announced that through the mercy of the Tsar, they would not be shot. But Dostoevsky was to be sentenced to 4 years imprisonment in Siberia. he breathed the air of freedom. He began to be a kind of an embodied spirit. His soul had come back into his body. Dante, because he wrote Inferno, has been described as the man who has been to hell. Dostoevsky was the man who looked death in the face and got back that elemental freedom, the freedom to live and move and have your being. You would understand freedom as well as any man in the world. That was his first creative moment. The second was when he learned the implications of that freedom. Christmas Eve of that year, he was put into a sleigh, driven out of St. Petersburg on a 3 weeks journey to Siberia. And as he left St. Petersburg, it was Christmas Eve. There was no room in the inn. You could see houses ablaze with lights, Christmas parties on the inside. So out to the stable of the world he goes, to Siberia. And what a place it was, as Dostoevsky describes it. He said, we were huddled in this barracks like herrings in a barrel. No room to turn around. Fleas and lice by the bushels. Temperature 30 and 40 degrees below zero. Ice 3 inches thick on the window pane. One stove in the center of a room never melted the ice in the room. A sheepskin to cover us, but it never covered our feet, and our feet froze. Filth on the floor, too cold to go outside to satisfy nature. Men would attempt to cross the floor and their chains would get caught in the chains of others, and they would fall, crack their heads, and curse. It was a veritable inferno of imprecation and curses and lecherous laughter. And out of it, later on, came the books describing what he had been through. Letters from the underworld and the house of the dead. Some of the most terrible pages of all literature. And what did he learn during this captivity in Siberia? He learned 3 lessons, and he puts them down in these books. And the first lesson that he learned was how evil men can be. He lived with characters, and he saw guards that could not be divided as novelists divide their characters into good and bad. He said there are some people who will abuse freedom to a point of wishing only evil. They lose the distinction, he said, of right and wrong. And they do not deny God merely. He says they challenge God. They set themselves up as an absolute. And he said, I found that while I was there, that man is open at 2 ends. First, he's open to the inspirations of grace. And then he said he's open to the devil himself. And some of these men, he said, wanted to do evil just for the sake of evil, even to make good evil. And as a result, he said, they became cruel. And I learned, he said, that it is possible for a man to become more cruel and bloodthirsty than any beast. As one of the characters said, there are only 2 periods in history. One is our ascent from the gorilla to the death of God, and the other is from the death of God to the making of a new earth through communism. That was his first lesson, how evil men can be. And the second lesson that he learned was about a social system that evil men can create. That social system that exists in the land where he lived. Churchill describes that land as the dividing of it as the Iron Curtain. That description would never satisfy Dostoevsky. Why? Why, because the Iron Curtain is from our side, the comfortable side, the side of real freedom, looking up against something opaque. When you pass through Siberia and see evil such as Dostoevsky saw, that description would never fit it. And so in Letters from the Underworld, he describes the new race of men and what it means to live under this type of man. And he describes it as the mouse facing the wall. He said a mouse will ultimately come to the last wall, and he will gnaw, but he cannot get through. A bull in the face of a wall will respect it. He will not charge it. It's something sacred. But a mouse will gnaw and gnaw and gnaw and be frustrated because he cannot get through. What is the wall? The wall is the impossible. It is that social system under which men must live unto eternal frustration. And the third lesson that he learned, he described it in these two books that I mentioned, was that the only alternative to this social system is Christ, in whom, as he rightly said, is God in the image of man. He said, I thank the Almighty that I have passed through Siberia, because I've learned now the essence of man. And I have also learned, he said, that it is only in Christ that I must repose. And later on, when Belinsky, the atheist, would try to win him over to his atheism, Dostoevsky said in his own queer way, he said, Belinsky, he said, I would rather be wrong with Christ than right with you. Prison spoiled some men and spoiled Oscar Wilde. He lost all of his creativity in prison. And he came out of prison. He wandered the streets of London under a diabolical pseudonym. He lost his power of writing because he'd been in prison, but not so Dostoevsky. He learned these great lessons. And Dostoevsky came out in order to come to the third moment of his life, the truly creative literary moment, in which he wrote some of the great pages of literature. For example, this is the man. Dostoevsky wrote in, first of all, the one that we will discuss first, Crime and Punishment, in 1866. The Possessed, 1872. We will not have time to discuss Brothers Karamazov, around 1879-80, before he died. In these works, he describes communism that is to come. And he describes it, well, first of all, in Crime and Punishment, where one of the characters is Raskolnikov, the individual communist. Raskolnikov does not believe in a distinction between right and wrong. good and bad. But he's interested in the masses. He's concerned about the poor. He wants to build up a social system. He's concerned with the proletariat. And this new social system that loves the masses must be built up. But in order to build it up, says Raskolnikov, you have to have money. So he kills a poor old woman pawnbroker to get money to establish his socialistic state. And he argues, she was vermin anyway. You see the system? You kill one, you aid 1,000 of the masses. That's simple arithmetic. That's communism. No concern whatever for the individual person. All that matters is the party state, the totalitarian structure. And hence let individuals, wherever they be, in Poland, Hungary, Albania, anywhere else, let them be wiped out. All that matters is the regime that professes to love the poor and tramples on them. Dostoevsky's, then in his work The Possessed, describes the state that has been set up by this philosophy. It's no longer concerned now with the individual communist. And Verhovinsky says the Russian Revolution will begin with an atheistic base. You see the characters of Dostoevsky, like Kirillov, Shigalov, Verhovinsky, father of other brothers Karamazov and others. Oh yes, they're in pages. Here they are in The Possessed. But these men, you cut a page, blood comes out, and they walk across the streets of Russia. They're living characters, they just have other names. Stalin, Lenin, Bulganov, Bulganin, Khrushchev. He wrote about them, he knew them all. He lived through them, he saw it coming. And so Verhovinsky said the foundation will be atheism, and then he talks to Stavrogin, and he tells Stavrogin just how he must develop this system, and Stavrogin prepares for it. And so he violates a girl, and then after he's violated her, he locks her in a room, and there's a little opening in the door. As he sips tea, he can look at her until she goes mad. And he enjoys his tea, and finally she goes mad, and she hangs herself, and Stavrogin said, Now, I no longer know the distinction between right and wrong. Now I am ready to establish the system. And so the characters walk out on the pages of The Possessed. And would you not think that some of these, I'm reading from The Possessed, some of these pages were written by someone who had passed through the experiences of communism today in Russia. He suggests a system of spying. Every member of society spies on the others, and it is his duty to inform against them. All are slaves and equal in their slavery. See, equality, all comrades. They will be banished and put to death. Cicero will have his tongue cut out. Copernicus will have his eyes put out. Shakespeare will be stoned. Slaves are bound to be equal. There never has been any freedom or equality without despotism, but in the herd, everyone will be equal. The moment you have family ties or love, you get the desire for property. We'll destroy that desire. We will make use of drunkenness, slander, spying. We'll make use of every incredible corruption. We'll stifle every genius in its infancy. We will reduce all to a common denominator, complete equality. Only the necessary is the necessary. That's the motto of the whole world from now on. The world needs a shock, and that's for us, the dictators, to look after. Absolute submission. Absolute loss of individuality. But once in 30 years, the dictator will let them have a shock, and they will suddenly begin eating one another up, just as a precaution against boredom. And then, Dostoevsky, knowing that this philosophy that has no respect for persons, that speaks of the love of the masses, will be a menace to the world, tells how it will win over. Does not mention America. But how true he was, writing too soon for us, perhaps. But he told how all the intelligentsia, the riffraff, the false liberals, all of the people, without a fine distinction of right and wrong, will follow after these individuals. And do you know, says the leader, that we are tremendously powerful already? Our party not only consists of those who commit murder and arson, fire off pistols in the traditional fashion, or bite colonels. They're only a hindrance. I reckon them all up. A teacher who laughs with children at their God is on our side. The lawyer who defends an educated murderer because he's more cultured than his victims and could not help murdering them to get money, he's one of us. The schoolboys who murder a peasant for the sake of sensation, they are ours. The juries who acquit every criminal, they are ours. The prosecutor who trembles at a trial for fear he should not seem advanced enough is ours. And among officials and intelligentsia and literary men, we have lots and lots of them, but they do not know it. And so we'll have a little fresh blood now and then, and we'll set legends going, and every scurvy group will be of use to us. I'll pick out some of you fellows that you'll be keen for shooting. Well, there's going to be an upheaval. There's going to be such an upset as the world has never seen before. Russia will be overwhelmed with darkness, and the whole earth will weep for its gods. In 1872, but did he despair? Though he knew the world would run after these Raskolnikovs and Shigalovs and Kirillovs? No, toward the end of his life, in the Journal of an Author, he wrote about a soldier, socialist soldier, who said he would commit the worst crime that one could ever commit. He would steal a host. And he stole a host. The Blessed Sacrament of the University came to visit me. He told me that as he went out the door, his 4-year-old daughter said, "Where are you going, Daddy?" He said, "I'm going to visit Bishop Sheen." She said, "He isn't on television now, is he?" "No," he said, "not during the summer." She says, "That's funny, Mickey Mouse is." I know one person who will be very, very happy to see me back on television, and that is a woman in Brooklyn. Because one day I was in a procession in Brooklyn. She was one of thousands on the sidewalk, and as I passed by, she says, "Glory be to God, you certainly look much better on television." Well, during the past 5 years, we've been giving you subjects on philosophy, theology, art, science, psychology, psychiatry, social sciences, and so forth. We gather them all into 4 volumes. Each year, we published a volume containing the various telecasts. And the last volume, that is to say, of last year's, is just now out. This is the 4th series. And my angel has finished reading all 4 because he got a pre-publication copy of last year. So he now has a B.S. degree, Bachelor of Sheen. he asked me to change the format this year. So this year we thought maybe you would be much more interested in hearing narratives and biographies. There's so many fictional and imaginative tales in the world. We thought that possibly you would like to hear some real stories of people who really and truly lived. And each week we will give you a different story. And tonight's the story of a playboy who heard the call of the desert. He was a great lover. Love is like a bird. You know, sometimes the bird is in the nest. When the bird is in the nest, his wings are confined and limited by that nest. And then at other times, the bird in the wing has the infinite horizons for his view. And sometimes the heart just rests in the nest of another creature, and at other times it's dissatisfied. And it seeks some great infinite love. And that's the story of the great lover of tonight, whose name perhaps you would like to know. First of all, he was a nobleman. He was born in the year 1858. His name, Charles de Foucault. 1858 was a very interesting year in the world. That was the year, just about that time, that Darwin published his Origin of Species. Marx, his introduction to the Critique of Political Economy. Essay on Liberty was published by Mill. Apparition of Lourdes that time, too. And in a house in Strasbourg, the very house, incidentally, where for the first time was sung by its author, Roger de Lille, the Marseillaise, was born a child who was known as the Viscount Charles de Foucault. Traced his family back to the Crusades. His family fought with King St. Louis. He was a kind of a stubborn-looking little child, as is evident from some of his pictures. He had a religious education and kept up religion until he was 15. He belonged to an age of renown, and Anatole France and others. The spirit of the century possessed him. He was sent to military school, the school of Saint-Cyr, and later on to Samir. He had a fortune, he had a title. He very seldom collected his military salary because he had too much money of his own. He finished about last in his class at Saint-Cyr, and when he went to the cavalry school, he finished 87th in the class of 87. Did you ever hear about the boy who brought his report card home from school, and he said to his daddy as he showed it to him, and the marks were very low, he said, "Dad, would you like me to go up in the attic and get some of your old report cards that I saw up there?" Well, that was the kind of report card that Charles de Foucault always brought home from school. He hardly ever ate in the military dining room. He ate in restaurants. One time he liked the wine that was served. He bought all the wine there was in the hotel. It cost him $4,000. He used to bring out a number of young ladies from Paris to entertain them at his dinners. One time he dressed himself up as a young woman, and he sat in a carriage outside of the windows of the military school, where all of the wolves began whistling at him. And of course they felt very sheepish when they discovered that he was a wolf himself, because they recognized the black mustache under his rouge. And then after he finished his military training, he was assigned briefly in France. And he gave a party one night for one of the girls that he liked best. It's too bad we do not know her name, just as we do not know the name of the young woman who figured in the life of Auguste She's just simply known as Mimi. That's plain Mimi. She came from poor parents, that we know. But she took on a bit of culture and refinement, probably from associating with him and his friends. One night he gave a party on the frozen river Meuse, and he had lanterns hanging from trees all about the river. And then, at a given signal, all of the lights were extinguished, save one, and that was the purple flame of a glowing punch bowl. And some of his friends then pushed across the ice on a sled that was disguised to look like a swan. They pushed across the ice, clothed in sables and silks, Mimi. And the Viscount raised his glass and toasted the honorary colonel of the 4th Hussars, the Queen of the Ice, Mimi. Colonel heard about it. The colonel gave a party. Viscount though he was, he did not invite Charles de Foucault. When the party of the colonel was over, it was raining heavily. And the colonel tried to get some carriages outside to take his guests home. And what was strange about it was all of the carriages went clippity-clop past the house of the colonel, not one single carriage stopping. Lo and behold, it happened that Charles de Foucault had rented all of them to pass by empty in order to get even with the colonel. But the colonel got even with him. He called him in 8 days later, and he said, "Foucault, in 8 days, you leave for Africa." One of the friends of the Viscount said, "What about Mimi?" He said, "Mimi goes to Africa, too." So he sent Mimi on ahead, on another ship. And she registered on the ship as the Vicomtesse Charles de Foucault. She ate at the captain's table, naturally. All the sub-officers bowed and scraped and kissed her hand and saluted her. And all were charmed by her beauty and her loveliness. And finally, when she arrived at the port of Beaune in Africa, that was one time Hippo. And 1,500 years before, there was another man there in Hippo that had a life something like this one. He was dissatisfied with his nest, too. That was Augustus. But at any rate, she arrived at Beaune, and she was met there by military officers, by the mayor of the city, and by other officials who saluted her as the Viscountess, took her to a hotel where a banquet was served, and then sometime later came on the ship with the other officers and the wives of the other officers, and lo and behold, it was discovered through the wives of the other officers that she was not at all the Viscountess de Foucault, that she was just plain Mimi. And women have a habit, you know, of gathering up their skirts and just leaving someone behind. But Mimi and Charles laughed. He didn't mind, neither did she. And then he was sent into the desert maneuvers. That did something to him. I was in the Sahara once. It's a curious place. You look up, the stars seem so close that you almost feel that you could reach up and just pluck them right out of the sky. You become tremendously impressed with the nothingness of man, with the sovereignty of God, in the face of this great, vast waste. And he was affected by it. He loved the Berbers. He began to love Arabic. And he came back from his maneuvers, and the colonel called him in. And he said, "Foucault, you have a woman here with you, is not your wife. I'm going to report you tomorrow to Paris. Foucault said, why wait until tomorrow? Report today. I resign. So he and Mimi left, went back to France, Paris, then they went to Evian. And when they went to Evian, Charles felt the call of the desert. And he began studying Arabic intensely and Hebrew and also the language of the Berbers. Well, Mimi didn't like to see Charles all the time with his nose stuck in a book. She got a bit tired of him. He got tired of her. So he paid her off just at the time that she found another patron, and poor Mimi disappears. We never hear of her again. It's too bad. It's been an interesting telecast for 15 minutes. But that's... I know you'd like me to go on and tell more about Mimi, but that's all I know about Mimi. This isn't a telecast about Mimi anyway. It's a telecast about Charles de Foucault. Well, his life changes. Do you know what changed his life? It wasn't Mimi. It was an Irishman. The Irish are apt to turn up anywhere. And this one was Oscar McCarthy. His first name was really Oscar. Oscar MacArthur's father came over from Ireland to fight with Napoleon. As a matter of fact, his father commanded one of the regiments at the Battle of Waterloo. And then the son of this original McCarthy wandered down to the most beautiful library in the world in Algiers. And there, for $60 a year, he became an expert on geography. And when Charles felt the call to the desert, he came back again to Algiers, and he went in to see Oscar McCarthy. And Charles said, I would like to go into the inside of Africa, among the Berbers, and into Morocco. How can I do it? McCarthy said only 6 men of Western civilization have been in there in my lifetime. It's very dangerous. You couldn't possibly go in as an Arab, because you do not speak Arabic well enough. They would find a trace of a false accent. McCarthy said, I suggest that you go in as a Jewish rabbi. And he said, I have a rabbi friend here who knows this country well. And you travel, 2 of you as rabbis. So Foucault and Rabbi Mordecai got together. Foucault made an arrangement with him that he would give him a sum of money before they started, pay all of his expenses, give him a handsome sum when he finished, and also pay his wife a pension while he was away. Foucault studies the liturgy, the ceremony of the synagogue, speaks Hebrew now almost perfectly. He was a good student when he wanted to be a good student. And they set out on a perilous journey. They lived in the utmost poverty. And what struck Foucault was the fact that here were these Muslims, the Arabs, had no human respect. 5 times a day at the time of the call to pray, they prayed. And then the Jews, so good to him and Rabbi Mordecai, they brought food to them when they slept in the synagogue. They received them into their own poor quarters. He began to love both of them in the desert more than ever. They were gone almost 1 year. And at the end of the year, they came out. And Charles de Foucault published a very famous work in 2 volumes called Reconnaissance au Maroc, where he had surveyed 3,000 elevations, 1,400 square miles, determined 45 degrees of latitude, 40 degrees of longitude, and made the whole scientific world his debtor. He came back into Paris. He was feted by everyone from prime ministers to jockey clubs. And In the course of his visits about Paris, he met an abbé, the curé of the church of Saint Augustin. Those of you who have been to Paris will recall that Renaissance church, Saint Augustin, Boulevard Haussmann. And this poor abbé was the kind of man that suffered a great deal, continuously, as a matter of fact. But it gave him that queer kind of wisdom that really comes from suffering. And Charles de Foucault met him one day, and he said, "What makes you so happy?" He said, "Because I never seek my own pleasure," said the abbé. And one night Charles came in from a party. He was still in his white tie and tails, silk cloak, silk hat, paced the floor. His wings wanted the air. He was dissatisfied with his nest, and he went to the church of Saint Augustin. He rapped the church door, the confessional door of Abbé Houblin. He says, "Abbé, come out. I would like to talk to you." Abbé Houblin says, "You come in. I would like to talk to you." And it was 14 years since Charles de Foucault had made a confession. He had the faith that was covered up with the cinders, the clinkers that come with all kinds of false pleasures. By that act of humility, all the clinkers disappeared. And from then on, he was totalitarian. As he'd gone to one extreme of being the playboy of Paris, from now on, he would go to the other extreme. It's now the time when the world is beginning to know something about totalitarianism. Men follow communism simply because they're sick and tired of a false milk and water liberalism. They want something into which to put their teeth, something that calls for engagement, consecration, dedication. The whole self must be given and surrendered. And rather than give it to a false absolute, Charles de Foucault now decides to give himself utterly and absolutely, as a bird on the wing, to the true absolute. And he knocks at a Trappist monastery door. The prior says, "What can you do?" "Not very much." "Read?" "A little." Swept floors for 2 years. But the desert called him, and he asked to be transferred to another Trappist monastery in Akbez, Syria, so he would be closer to the desert. He went there, and in those days, still, you know, the Trappists never eat meat, fish, or eggs. And in those days, they never cooked the vegetables that they had in butter. Foucault was growing discontent with the Trappist rule. It was not strict enough. He said, "The good Lord traveled third class. Why should I travel first class?" But the church thought the Trappists were too strict, and at that particular time, the church told the Trappists to cook their food in butter. Well, when Foucault heard that, that was too much. He said, "Here we are on the downgrade. What's going to happen to us? Where are we going to end? Today butter, tomorrow what?" Why, he says, "That means so much less for the poor." And so he began writing out a rule of life that he would like to follow, in which there would be absolute poverty. And he wrote in his notebook, "I must be prepared to die a martyr, to be thrown in a ditch, killed painfully, brutally, unmercifully. That I must be prepared for." Then he wandered around Nazareth and the Holy Land for a while. And finally, he went into the desert. He was ordained at 42, then went first to Ben Abez. You'll see it sometime if you look at a map. That's a cue for the cameraman, incidentally. Where's my little map? There it is. It's coming. There it is, right there. That's it. There it is. Well, he went first, you see, down to Ben Abbas, and then all the way down. That was a quick journey. All the way down to Tamarasset. And here he lived in a little mud hut that he built, had only one room. His robe was white, had a cross on the side of it, a red cross. And here, this Charles de Foucault, as you see him in the robe, he used to take care of the poor, the sick, the lame, the blind. This was now the playboy, the hermit in the desert. He gave needles to the women, seeds to the men, gave clothing. He took care of those who were suffering from malaria, typhus, and other diseases of the desert. He bought and redeemed slaves that were in the hands of some of the Muslims, and then set them free. And at night, 1 hour, 2 hours of sleep, all the rest dedicated to prayer. Just that. And he did. Also, a dictionary for the people that he loved. A 700-page dictionary. And one night, he had come to the word Matamal, in the language of the desert. And he wrote the words slowly. Matamal. And then translated into French. To kill. There was a knock at the door. Who's there? Almadian, one of the men whom he had aided for years. Almadian said, I have some mail for you. And the hermit reached out his hand. Almadian grabbed it. 40 men grabbed him. And they pulled him out of his hut. And they threw him into a ditch. And they beat him, and then they put a gun to his temple. And he who said he must be prepared to die a martyr's death now died. Now died that way. Sometime later, the French soldiers found him there and found a monstrance with a host on the inside. The Lord had suffered the same lot as himself. And then he was buried there, and then taken out of the grave, and buried farther north in the desert at El Golea. As the priest was preaching the sermon, he had on exactly the same costume as Foucault. He looked down and he saw a woman who was dressed exactly like Foucault too, and he spoke to her. Why are you dressed that way? And lo and behold, it developed that the two of them, unknown to one another, had found the rule of Charles de Foucault, and both of them had founded a community to live by absolute poverty. There are 200 men and women in the world, some in Africa, some in the Sahara, some in France, some here in America, who are living by the rule of the playboy who became a saint. Which proves that it does not take much time to make a saint. It takes only